Ashivenu, Ashivenu, Adonai Elecha, Venashuva, Venashuva, Hadash, Hadash, Yameinu Kedar. Ashivenu, Ashivenu, Hashem Elecha, Venashuva, Venashuva, Chodesh, Chodesh, Yameinu Kedar. Ashivenu, Ashivenu, Adonai Elecha, Venashuva, Venashuva, Hadash, Yameinu Kedar. Good evening, friends. Nice to be with you all. What I appreciate about that chant is the understanding implicit that it sometimes takes an invitation to feel able to return. Ideally, it doesn't. Perhaps the ideal human state of repentance would be just utterly self-motivated. But sometimes we need to be invited back. Return us, God, and we shall return. So, good evening, friends. We're going to start tonight with thinking about success stories such as they are, making amends done well. And I would say done well and not done perfectly, because it's really impossible to know if any act of amends making is done perfectly. As we may have noticed from our studies of Maimonides last week, to do teshuvah completely is to be in a process of teshuvah forever, right? It's rather like being in recovery. And so the test of how well it's ultimately done is in the long term, in the transformation long term. And yet, we probably all know what an ineffectual attempt at amends or an ineffectual apology feels like. And we know what a good effort feels like too. So just for fun and for the sake of being multimedia, we're going to start this evening with something that one of you sent me from This American Life. And I'm sorry, I didn't ask permission. I didn't think to ask permission of the person who sent it to me to share their name. But if you are willing to take credit for being the one to think of this, I'd love for you to share your name, to share and share why you found this moving.
Sure, it's Julie. And I'm a fan of Ira Glass and This American Life, as many of you probably are. And this was, instead of doing 3 stories, he did 20 stories in an hour. And the last one was just struck me as I was listening to it that it's an apology but it covers a lot of the things that that we talked about last week. So I thought it might be fun.
Awesome. So yeah, so it's a 2-minute story, and I'm gonna screen share just because that's how I can share computer sound. Um, and we'll listen to it and then invite you to reflect on it a little bit. And then the other, I like the idea of doing this, of starting class each week with stories either shared by you all or, that you find in the public sphere of amends making. So that's how we're starting tonight.
The greatest moment I ever saw on a stage. I'll say first of all that this moment that I saw caught me completely off guard. I was at a play where I was not expecting anything special. It was put on by an organization that works with teenagers. Storycatchers Theater is what it's called. And among other things, they get kids who are locked up in Chicago's juvenile detention center, the Audi home, to write and perform musicals about their lives. This one was performed by teenage girls. Okay, so we're in the detention center. Folding chairs have been set up. The girls' parents, it's mostly mothers and grandmothers, very few men, are sitting directly in front of the stage. And imagine for a minute what it's like to be one of those parents, okay? Your kid's locked up, possibly on very serious charges, some of these girls were. You're worried about what's going to happen to them next. You're probably still mad that they didn't listen to you in the first place and got into all this trouble and ended up behind bars. What can theater possibly do for you in this situation? You know? It seems like such an old-fashioned idea that it can do anything. So, there's this one scene in the play.
Where'd you get these clothes from?
And it's the story of this girl named Candace. And Candace basically wanted better clothes so the other kids at school wouldn't laugh at her. And so she steals some clothes from Nike Town and she gets in trouble, she gets caught, and then she joins a gang to earn some money and be more popular. Her mom finds some drugs in the house and a gun, and feels completely betrayed because that was not how she raised her daughter, and one thing leads to another, and Candace gets locked up. Then, the girl narrating this story says, and this is how Candace feels about her mom now. And then all the girls in the play come out on the stage and stand in a line, facing their mothers and grandmothers who are right there in front of them.
Mama, I'm sorry for what I have done. I was arrested and ended up here in the Audi home. Oh, I'm sorry for putting you through all of this. I know you are mad about the good times that we missed. I'm ready to come back home. I'm willing to make a change.
One of the verses goes, Mama, I'm sorry for making you come to court, for almost losing your job to give me moral support. Mama, I'm sorry for putting you through all this stress, for making you worry yourself and depressed. I'm ready to come back home. I'm willing to make a change. And by this time, the girls are all crying, their parents are all crying, and each girl has a cutout, you know, like a little heart, like on Valentine's Day, like that, made from red construction paper, like the size of your palm. And written on each one is the words, I'm sorry. And each girl goes out into the audience to where her mom is sitting or her grandma is sitting and hands her the heart. And the parents are crying and the kids are crying and everybody is hugging. It was really something.
I'll do anything for you, Mom. Please forget about yesterday. Mama, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Here they were, not just saying this to their mothers, but saying it publicly, in front of the world, in front of their friends, saying this thing that could be so hard to say in any case, you know, singing it out and hoping that it can heal something that is going to be hard to heal, no matter what you do.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
And that's our show for today. 20 acts in 60 minutes. Thanks today to Atlantic Public Media, WCAI, and WNAM. Our web.
When I thought about starting with this, I had this thought about sort of unpacking the completeness of that teshuva. But on this second listen, I'm just very moved, even more moved than I was in the first listen. And yeah, there's something for me about this story and, about all teshuva stories that I think just brings out the beautiful vulnerability of humans. We don't know if all those girls were able to leave the Audi home, if they all did teshuva with the other people that they had harmed, if they didn't repeat those harms. But in that moment, just the potential
Mhm.
and their vulnerability is quite profound. Julie is our contributor. Is there more you want to say about that?
I think I was struck by the public nature of it. That they were supporting each other in this and feeling it sincerely and doing it publicly. And we don't know what happened next, but that the parents and the grandparents really felt it as real also, and that they said what they had done. They said, I'm sorry you lost your job because you were supporting me. I know you're sad you're missing the good times with me. They actually itemize some of the harms.
So, chapter 2 of this book on repentance and repair is dealing with repentance in personal relationships, which Rabbi Ruttenberg opens the book by noticing that it's really hard. And if I could sort of narrow down to what is so very hard about it in her observations, it comes down to the word story. We have a hard time doing teshuva, repenting, attempting to repair harms we have done, because the idea that we might need to repair something so contradicts a story that we have about ourselves. And those of you who, I believe all of you have tried to read this book and this chapter at least, but she opens by talking about a supervisor who consistently dismissed the fact that someone on her team was colorblind and literally could not see the things that everyone else was looking at, and how the supervisor really struggled to come to terms with even understanding that what she was doing was harmful, because she didn't mean any harm, because she was a good person, because she was afraid to apologize, because she was worried that she would be told an unpleasant story about herself. And Rabbi Ruttenberg has this amazing line on page 49: addressing harm is possible only when we bravely face the gap between the story we tell about ourselves, the one in which we're the hero, fighting the good fight, doing our best, behaving responsibly and appropriately in every context, and the reality of our actions. none of us live up to the vision that we hold of ourselves all the time. And I imagine many of us actually dance between poles of that heroic narrative and a very self-hating narrative about how we're failures, we're hypocritical, we hurt people, we're a waste of space. It is very hard to live in the more truthful space between those poles, that we are human beings who sometimes cause harm, who sometimes can do wonderful deeds. But to actually step into that space between, as Rabbi Rettenberg says, is the only way we can even begin to undertake any possible repair of the harm we've done and become the kind of person who might do better next time. And that, in my opinion, is what's truly heroic. So, I want to ask a discussion question and send you into breakout rooms to discuss the discussion question. Does everybody have access to the book in some way? Again, I know that some of you are listening on Audible, and I'm not really sure how that translates into like discussing a certain segment on a certain page. But I don't want to be like the case study at the beginning of this chapter and deny the fact that it matters. I get that it matters, but I might need some guidance on how to deal with it if there are those of you in that situation. The first segment we're going to be discussing is pages 58 to 60. And it may be that it makes sense in your small group to read that out loud. It may be that you all have access to looking at those pages and want to just scan them individually. But these pages are really, I would say, about how we let go of the narratives and what narratives might serve us in attempting to repent. So I'm going to put the discussion question in the chat. And I do think some of what Rabbi Ruttenberg says on these pages is somewhat provocative. So we're going to go into that. But first, let's do a deep dive into looking at these pages. It may take a little while to read. So I'm going to send you into small groups for like 15 minutes. And you can discuss these questions. Oops, I accidentally pasted it twice. Everybody see in the chat the instruction? Okay. So I'm going to pause the recording and send you into groups. Welcome back, friends. I guess rooms 3 through 5 are finishing up some thoughts. It looks like room 3 and 4 are entirely running down the clock. Welcome back, everyone, especially those of you in room 3 and 4 who were just cut off rudely. Apologies. If any of you want to express gratitude to each other in the chat, you're welcome to. The recording is live now. So I first wanted to invite anyone who is willing to have their thoughts on YouTube for posterity, because we are recording, to share your thought about this framing. from Rabbi Ruttenberg about the impetus for repentance. What do you find compelling? What do you find challenging? Is any part of this problematic? And don't worry, I'll take a few thoughts and then I'll also stop the recording and offer some time for those who don't want your thoughts recorded to also share. Caitlin and her beasts, please.
And my monsters. We talk when I think about the relational component of it, one of the ideas that is still kind of trickling around in my head is what to do when you don't necessarily want the relationship to continue, or you don't want to be in relationship, either as the harmed or the harmer. And I mean, we talked a little bit about it from the reading from last time and then a little bit today, but it's definitely still a thought that's just, I think, gonna fester and percolate how to make amends when the other person, and repentance and transformation, when the other person doesn't want to be involved, or when I don't want to be involved, or we're both just ready to walk in different directions.
Yeah. Certainly wanting the relationship can be a powerful motivator for repair when we've done wrong, knowing like, not only do I care about this person, I care about them, I want them in my life, maybe I want them in my life a certain way. I'm not going to have that unless I fix this thing that I've messed up. Speaking personally, and I invite you all to reflect, not necessarily out loud, but I'm willing to share personally. This has happened in my life that I know I have needed to do repair with people that I'm not necessarily interested in having long-term ongoing relationship with. And I actually find it very helpful as a closure to the relationship that I want to end anyway, knowing that I have ended it cleanly, fixing what needed to be fixed. I'm seeing some nods. So, personally, I still find it sometimes even more so powerful to try to do repair with someone I don't want to stay in a relationship with long term. Because the flip side of the motivation that happens when you're really in it with someone and you're in it forever is that you can kind of defer fixing the messy stuff indefinitely. Maybe there's enough forgiveness, maybe there's enough slack that we can let things go unfixed. Whereas we know, well, this is going to be done one way or another soon. So I may want the relief of getting it done right. I see a bunch of other hands, so it seems like Caitlin's thought and my response has stirred up some thoughts. So great. Let's hear from Barbara and Carrie.
There's kind of, you can stand that on its head and just in a very personal way. One of my cousins, we grew up as neighbors. We were constantly together. We traveled together as young women. We were up, we were bridesmaids for each other. And she didn't come to my father's funeral, and she didn't come to one of my kids' weddings. And I was really, really, really upset. And um and I kind of held her at arm's length for a while, and then I didn't want to do that anymore, and I got in touch. But she wanted to talk about it, and I really didn't want to talk about it. And I don't want to not have the relationship, but I don't want to do the repair work because I think I just don't see. So yeah, I, and
You
I'm not sure why I'm sharing this, except that it's kind of eating at me all the time.
you want her, you don't want to hear about, can I just clarify? You don't want to hear about why she didn't show up, but you want her to show up in the future.
No,
No. Okay.
because I know why she didn't show up.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to. She wants to talk about me being mad and what's up with that, and I'm kind of like, I'm done being mad, but I don't want to talk about it. I felt like she did me harm, but she felt like in my holding her at arm's length, I did her harm.
Mm.
So, and I'd be really happy to just go back to being cousins who care about each other and not deal with any of it. So I don't know. Sometimes repair work, whichever end of it you're on, it's like therapy. It's hard and it's painful. And if you've had a relationship with someone for 65 years and you've had a small breach, do you really have to?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you do. I don't know.
Well, I think what you're speaking to is when there's a relationship for a long time, unless there's a really serious imbalance of power and agency, over time, all the parties to the relationship are going to have grievances. It's not going to just be that, one person is hurting another, with the caveat that I just said. But in most relationships, there are going to be grievances sometimes, and all the parties are going to feel like, well, you weren't honest with me about this. Well, you weren't paying attention about this, and you didn't want to listen. And it can be very difficult to disentangle. So if we think about it from, I don't know, Barbara, are you willing for us to sort of play with
Oh,
workshopping what you just
I
shared with us?
I wouldn't have shared it if I didn't want to hear what people, I mean,
So
yes.
if we think about this, I mean, like there's ways to think about it, like from a therapeutic perspective. Um, actually, before I even finish that thought, some of you are therapists and can think about what the therapeutic perspective is, can share what it is. But, and then if you want to think about it from like a blame perspective, we can think about like who did the worst thing. If we want to think about it from a teshuva perspective of, is there some way that I, in my agency in this relationship, want to transform? What happens? I mean, does something useful happen? And it could be that that's not really the frame that works best for you for this situation. But one thing that I remind myself all the time is that I can't do other people's tshuva, right? If I am in a situation that just feels gnarly and I don't like how people are behaving, the only behavior I can 100% shift, maybe not even 100%, the only behavior I can come close to 100% shifting is my own. Meaning, I can try being more honest, or I can try being more gentle, or I can try being more firm. Right? I can't make other people experiment with trying different behaviors. All I can do if the situation is gnarly is see if transforming my own behavior affects it. And so you want your relationship with your cousin to look a certain way. And I think the question is, what does she need from you for her to be willing for the relationship to look that way? And are you willing to do that? And then if you're not willing to do that, are you willing to live with the consequences of not doing that? But I think now I'm straying a little too close to therapy. So we'll bring the conversation back to Chuva.
No,
I see also,
that's helpful.
I also see some really helpful things in the chat. It can be very satisfying in the process of saying goodbye, sharing what has been special and rich in the relationship while wishing each other well with no need to reconnect, which I think is true, although probably not what Barbara is looking for in this moment. And someone else writes, I think the question is, can we just move on? And I think the answer is if one person asks for or needs to talk, so the relationship is clear, we need to give the gift of teshuva to the person requesting it or not. LOL. No, I liked, you're shrugging now, but I liked the clarity with which you said that. I think you can leave the or not. All right. Carrie and Jessica have been waiting, so let's hear from them.
Well, something Barbara said, like reminded me a little bit of what we talked about in our group regarding, and it connects a little bit with this idea of self-care and benefits and drawback of thinking about it that way. And often when someone else has done us harm, instead of repairing in a way of trying to honestly help the person that you hurt, it's a lot of saying sorry, but then wanting to revisit why they did it and why they didn't mean it and why you shouldn't have been upset. And it's a lot more about them. And you guys should at the beginning, Rabbi, wanting to shift the story and really still make it about them. And I was just hearing a little bit of that maybe in Barbara's about like having to revisit everything and have the other friend say, sorry, and then have it, it's still back about them. And so how we have to be careful as the receiver and the giver, and we think about repair, about how much we make it about ourselves. So that was one thing. And then the other thing I was going to bring up is back to what Caitlin had mentioned about when you draw the line about stopping that repair process or just saying I'm not going forward. When it's you can say, okay, I'm going to eventually distance myself, but I want to say sorry or repair what I did. But when it's the other person wanting to do the repair, is there ever a line where you say, you have to do this before I will allow the repair to happen? And I shared a story in our group about my brother, who I love dearly and I miss dearly. We have no contact with him because he has threatened to call child abuse on us for having a child in a queer relationship and says that we're horrible parents and going to hell and we shouldn't exist. But he still wants to hang out. Like during COVID, he called a family. He wanted to play family board games. And he said, Carrie, just don't talk about your family and then you can come. And then was really upset when I said, I'm not going to do that. And the rest of the family said, we're not going to do that. And he's really was upset that we're not accepting his attempt to, what he says is repair. Like, can't we just like repair this rift and all get along? And this is how to do it. Just don't talk about Carrie's family. Right? And it's like, I'm not going to accept that, even though he really wants to repair.
Right. And that reminds me on sort of the more global scale of the examples of repair that Rabbi Rettenberg starts the book with in her introduction, right? Like the North and the South coming together after the Civil War. Like, yeah, well, when someone has done something that is harmful and dehumanizing, it's great if we can repair, but part of what has to be part of that process has to be undoing the harm and acknowledging the dehumanization.
Especially if you want to like frame it as a relationship, well, then it has to be a caring, healthy relationship, right?
Ouch.
Your brother is denying who you are. You
Right.
know, it's my brother did the same thing with my being Jewish. Every sibling in my family is a different faith, and my brother just refused to consider me a Jew. Just nope. And he used very derogatory terms describing Jews, and he said, no, you're not one. I don't care if you go to that place to pray. I don't care about any of this other stuff. You're not a Jew, and you're not going to make my niece a Jew. You know, so yeah, I understand what you're saying, and did not understand when I didn't want to be around him.
And I mean, I think one thing that is so hard about this world, this beautifully interconnected and diverse world that we live in, is that we are in intersecting communities where the definition of harm is different. So, right, you are, Carrie, related to someone who thinks that it is that exposure to non-heteronormative life is harmful.
Right.
And you know, Marcia, it sounds like maybe your brother actually believes that Judaism is denying your daughter the opportunity to have salvation and is harmful.
Yeah.
And then we are operating, I would say, perhaps presumptuously, the 26 of us in this Zoom space are operating in a collective community that has a really different definition of harm.
Right.
And so one person's attempt to undo harm winds up actively enacting harm against other people and communities. And so
That's very insightful.
I think it's really, there's not a right answer to how much
Right.
compassion and tolerance we have for that.
Right.
There cannot be an absolute right answer to that. So there's a great question in the chat about what guidance does Maimonides offer about defining harm? Who gets to decide? We may not like the answer that I have, which is that it's defined by halakha. It's defined by Jewish law. There's very specific definitions. If we're violating mitzvot, if we're violating commandments, we are doing harm. Maimonides, I mean, and there's certain things that are perhaps translatable, right? Like Maimonides probably does not acknowledge the existence of queer relationships or the validity of queer relationships, being a 12th century Jewish Spanish sage. However, Maimonides does have a passage where he talks about how one should not call another person by a name they find humiliating. That is harm. And that is forbidden, right? So like that is a very extrapolatable mitzvah to thinking about LGBTQ, particularly trans and gender issues. That like we can actually refer to Maimonides for guidance that whatever one's individual feelings about the immutability of assigned gender may be, the Rambam, Maimonides says, you call a person by a name they do not find humiliating. That's the law. Which I guess is a long way of saying there's sort of wiggle room to this question. I see 3 more hands. We are still recording. So I'm going to take these 3 comments and then I'm going to turn off the recording in case anyone wants to say anything that's not going to be saved for posterity. Go ahead, Jessica.
So when I read, just kind of puts back to like pages like 58 to 60, and it talks about kind of putting yourself in the other person's shoes and thinking of, well, what would I want in forgiveness from that person that I did wrong to? And just reading that section and stuff, it got me just thinking about kind of, and I mentioned this in our breakout group about my relationship with my biological mom, and just kind of, what do you do in a situation where somebody has done wrong and hurt you but they don't realize it because of a mental illness. And, you know, after you've kind of made peace with what has happened, and you realize that the forgiveness that is needed is not for me to forgive and feel better, but for them to do, for me to forgive them for them. And so this is kind of just kind of something that's been kind of mulling around in my head as I've been reading and listening to the book and stuff. It's just kind of like sometimes forgiveness is not for you, it's for the other person. And, you know, they, even if they don't realize it, like wholeheartedly that they did something wrong, but in some part of their brain, they do realize they did wrong, but they are trying their best with the mental capabilities they have to ask for forgiveness in their own way. And so, yeah, just kind of, it's really given me a lot of food for thought for that situation, to just be like, okay, it's not about me in this situation to forgive, and it's about her and her needing that forgiveness. So
That's beautiful if you can do that. It's also very advanced and it is not what is demanded of us. I think
yeah.
it's really important. We talked about it a little bit last week. Like we are a Judaism is a teshuva forward tradition, meaning like
Mhm.
what is expected is teshuva when we've done wrong. It's not a forgiveness forward tradition. We are not expected to forgive something that someone else hurts that others have done to us
Mhm.
until they have done complete teshuva, and maybe then, and it's a little bit arguable. And so if we can, there's so many reasons why it might be a good idea, right? And I think you've articulated that beautifully. There's so many reasons we might aspire to be the kind of compassionate person who can really look with love and forgiveness at another person's limitations and not
Mhm.
expect of them what they are not able to do. And it is not required of us.
Yeah. And that's something I've realized like through a lot of therapy, to like kind of work through my thoughts and feelings about the situation. And, it's, you know, she's got paranoid schizophrenia and multiple personalities. So she doesn't like realize that she did so much damage and harm and pain and everything when we were kids. And I think my kind of having a therapist tell me like, hey, stop, think about it, you know she's doing all of these things not to like ask, she doesn't know how to ask for forgiveness. So what she's doing is like her way of like asking forgiveness in a way, and it's just kind of up to you to work through those feelings and forgive her for her but not for you, because it's doing her more harm and causing her harm for me not forgiving her. So, and it almost like it's a little vicious cycle, like, okay, she caused all this pain and harm to me, but me not forgiving her is causing her pain. And so do I want to continue to inflict that pain when I have the power to say, okay, I forgive you, and maybe not forgive and move on, but forgive and at least participate enough in her life so that she doesn't feel isolated and alone and without her kids.
Oh, what a difficult case, right? Because there's a
Yeah.
couple different obligations here. We are, as Jews, obligated in kibud av v'em. We are obligated to honor our parents. We're obligated to make sure they're not alone and uncared for in old age, that they are treated with dignity. Ideally, we are obligated ourselves to treat them with dignity. And I'm going to hold the line because I'm not a therapist, I'm a rabbi. Jewish tradition does not hold that you are doing her more harm by refusing to forgive her. You may be making your own life more difficult because she's going to spiral in ways that are more needy and more harmful, because if you could just say these words or whatever it is. But we do hold, again, that humans have a lot of potential. And again, so to not forgive doesn't mean you would actively wish her harm, that you would withhold meeting of her basic needs, but you are allowed to have some boundaries around what relationship we seek. And
Yeah.
yes, to the comment in the chat, forgiveness is a very independent process of teshuvah often. I'm gonna pause the recording. So there's a great question in the chat. Am I correct in hearing that it is a mitzvah to love our neighbor and to rebuke our neighbor, but not necessarily to forgive them? Yes. It is a mitzvah to love our neighbor. It is a mitzvah to take care of our neighbor's physical needs, right? We should never, under any circumstances, let our neighbor go hungry or unhoused. And it is a mitzvah to rebuke them, to try to hold them accountable when they have caused hurt or harm. And it is not a mitzvah to forgive them, although Maimonides will say if at a certain point our neighbor has done complete teshuvah and sought to make amends and really humbled themselves and done it in the context of community multiple times, at that point, we may be at a point where there is a mitzvah to forgive them, but not until that point. So then the question, and this comes later in the book, is what do we do with the situations where what the person needs is not to have contact? And I might say, Jessica, that could be another version of how you tell your story. Like from a Jewish traditional perspective, it would be totally acceptable to tell the story of this person has hurt me. They are incapable of not hurting me, and therefore I'm going to be done. And from the perspective of this tradition, that has to be an option if we're centering the needs of the person who is, recovering from harm. And I think it's really useful that this book tends to actually centralize the question from the perspective of a perpetrator of harm, because we're all perpetrators of harm sometimes. And we all need to come to terms with the idea that sometimes, we want to fix things, and sometimes the best way to fix things is to respect a boundary that has been set up. But that's challenging. Go ahead, Lori.
I am all about boundaries. But then I question when it's your parents, like balancing the honoring your parent and taking care of them versus they're making me crazy. I need to, set a boundary and create safety for yourself. It's tough.
It's really tough. And I think it's also tough. I mean, you use two loaded words, right? You use the word crazy and you use the word safety. And there's a wide range of parental behaviors, I imagine, that could be described as making their children crazy. And there's a wide range of parental behaviors that could be described as making their children feel unsafe. So, and I think if there is a there are certainly pitfalls to our current progressive culture, one of which is a confusion about the distinction between comfort and safety. We are not obligated to be comfortable. We're not obligated to make each other comfortable. And sometimes we have been encouraged to define ourselves as unsafe when what we are is uncomfortable. So it is a fact of life that our parents are going to make us uncomfortable. Ideally, right? If they're doing their job as parents, they're going to make us uncomfortable. So again, I think there's a great deal of gradation in these situations, but it does come down to we have certain obligations to our parents that continue to apply no matter what other harms they have done. And even if we are unwilling to, ever be in a room alone with a parent, which for many reasons might be a valid decision someone would need to make, that wouldn't obviate the obligation to make sure our parents' basic needs are met and that they are aging in dignity. And yes, we will ultimately all be separated from our parents sooner or later. So there's a balance. There's a balance as we think about the harms done to us. How much are we, and I think I'm hearing from a lot of us that we're thinking about it in those terms, how much are we willing to invest in someone else's transformation for the sake of a relationship that we hope could improve and maybe couldn't? And maybe it's just very altruistic to invest in another person's teshuvah. And how much do we want to set a boundary? And as people who have harmed others, how much do we want to invite them into our own process of transformation? And how and when do we discern that attempting to do that will just be opening a wound that causes more harm? And we have an obligation to ask that question. We don't have an obligation to get the answer right, but we have an obligation to ask that question. So I want to close with another quote from Maimonides. That is what this book is about. And it's a quote that could be experienced as extraordinarily stressful or extraordinarily redemptive. I'm not sure how you'll feel it. If it causes you harm, I apologize and I will be willing to hear about it. We were studying a bunch from chapter 2 of his book on repentance last week. This is the fourth halacha, the fourth law in chapter 3. Oops, that is the wrong screen share. I meant to share this. Okay. Here we go. He's talking about the call of the shofar and how it invites us to awaken, particularly at the time of Rosh Hashanah and the new year. And I'm going to ask for a volunteer to read from Accordingly. Someone willing to unmute and read? Go ahead, Marcia.
Accordingly, throughout the entire year, a person should always look at himself as equally balanced between merit and sin, and the world as equally balanced between merit and sin. If he performs one sin, he tips his balance, and that of the entire world to the side of guilt, and brings destruction upon himself. On the other hand, if he performs one mitzvah, he tips his balance and that of the entire world to the side of merit, and brings deliverance and salvation to himself and others.
Thank you, Marcia. That's the important part. So, what I love so much about this quote is its firm reminder to keep ourselves grounded in an attitude of possibility, right? In the story that we are not inherently good and we are not inherently bad. And what we have done in the past matters much less than what we are about to do in any given moment. In any given moment, no matter what we have done in the past, we should see ourselves as equally balanced and full of potential so that what we do next really matters. So may it be so. And I will look forward to seeing you again next week and discussing chapter 3, thinking about making amends for public or publicly implicated harms.
Rabbi, aren't we
Yeah.
skipping a week of class next
Yes.
week?
Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm sorry. Way back when I scheduled this class, I had another obligation already scheduled for the 17th. I will see you in 2 weeks when we talk about harm in the public sphere. If you have any feedback from tonight, please do feel free to let me know. Good evening, friends.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks
Bye,
for everyone.
everyone.